The wind howled through the snow-covered mountains, carrying with it a biting cold that seemed to pierce through even the thickest layers of clothing. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, golden light over the vast expanse of white. In the middle of this frozen wilderness stood a small, weathered ranch, its wooden walls creaking under the weight of the snow that had piled up over the winter. This was the home of John Carter, a man who had spent most of his life in solitude, tending to his cattle and living a simple, quiet life. John was a man of few words, his face weathered by years of hard work and the harsh elements. His hands were rough and calloused, a testament to the countless hours he had spent chopping wood, mending fences, and caring for his animals. He had once been married, but that was a long time ago. His wife had passed away many years earlier, leaving him alone in this vast, empty landscape. Since then, John had become a recluse, rarely venturing into the nearby town, and even more rarely speaking to anyone other than his animals. But despite his loneliness, John had found a certain peace in the solitude. He had grown accustomed to the silence, the stillness of the mountains, and the rhythm of the seasons. He had his routines, his chores, and his animals to keep him company. And though he often felt the weight of his isolation, he had learned to live with it, finding solace in the simple pleasures of life. On this particular morning, John woke up early, as he always did. He pulled on his heavy boots, wrapped himself in a thick coat, and stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under his feet as he made his way to the barn, where his small herd of cattle was waiting to be fed. The animals greeted him with low, contented moos, their breath visible in the frosty air. John smiled faintly as he filled their troughs with hay, his hands moving automatically as he went about his work. But as he was finishing up, something caught his eye. In the distance, near the edge of the forest, he saw a strange disturbance in the snow. It looked as though a large section of the mountainside had collapsed, sending a cascade of snow and debris tumbling down into the valley below. John frowned, his brow furrowing as he squinted at the scene. Avalanches were not uncommon in these parts, especially after heavy snowfall, but something about this one felt different. There was a sense of unease in the air, a feeling that something was not quite right. John hesitated for a moment, torn between his curiosity and the knowledge that venturing out into the snow-covered wilderness could be dangerous. But something inside him urged him to investigate. He grabbed his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and set off toward the site of the avalanche. The journey was treacherous, the snow deep and unyielding. John's boots sank into the soft powder with every step, and the cold bit at his exposed skin. But he pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite explain. As he drew closer to the avalanche site, he began to hear faint, high-pitched sounds, whimpers, almost like the cries of a wounded animal. His heart quickened, and he quickened his pace, his breath coming in short, visible puffs. When he finally reached the site, the scene that greeted him took his breath away. The avalanche had carved a massive scar into the mountainside, leaving behind a chaotic jumble of snow, rocks, and broken trees. But what caught John's attention were the small, dark shapes moving weakly amidst the debris. At first, he thought they were rocks or chunks of wood, but as he drew closer, he realized with shock that they were bear cubs, 8 of them, to be exact. The cubs were tiny, no bigger than a large dog, their fur matted with snow and ice. They were huddled together, their small bodies trembling from the cold. Some of them were whimpering softly, while others lay still, their breaths shallow and labored. John's heart ached at the sight. He had seen many things in his years as a rancher, but nothing had prepared him for this. He knelt down beside the cubs, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch one of them. The cub flinched at his touch, but it was too weak to move away. John's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. He knew that bear cubs this young would not survive long in the cold, especially without their mother. But where was she? Had she been caught in the avalanche as well? Or had she abandoned her cubs in a desperate attempt to save herself? John didn't have time to ponder these questions. He knew that he had to act quickly if he wanted to save the cubs. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the shivering animals, trying to shield them from the cold. Then, with a strength born of desperation, he began to dig through the snow, searching for any sign of the mother bear. But as the minutes passed and the cold began to seep into his bones, he realized that his efforts were in vain. The mother bear was nowhere to be found. With a heavy heart, John made a decision. He couldn't leave the cubs here to die. He would have to take them back to his ranch and care for them himself. It was a risky move. Raising bear cubs was no small task, and he had no idea how to care for them. But he couldn't just walk away, not when their lives were in his hands. Gently, he gathered the cubs in his arms, cradling them against his chest. They were heavier than he had expected, and their combined weight made it difficult to move. But John was determined. He trudged back through the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with the effort. The journey back to the ranch felt like an eternity, but finally, he reached the safety of his barn. He laid the cubs down on a bed of hay, his hands shaking as he checked them over for injuries. They were cold and weak, but they were alive. For now, that was enough. John knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it. He had spent so many years alone, but now he had a new purpose. He would care for these cubs, protect them, and give them a chance at life. As he looked down at the tiny, shivering creatures, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection, of belonging. These cubs needed him, and in a strange way, he needed them too. They were a reminder that even in the coldest, most desolate places, there was still warmth, still life. And so, the lonely rancher began a new chapter in his life, one that would change him in ways he could never have imagined. But little did he know, this was only the beginning of an incredible journey, one that would test his strength, his courage, and his heart in ways he had never thought possible. The barn was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the 8 bear cubs huddled together on the bed of hay. John Carter stood over them, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he had just done. He had brought them here, to his ranch, to his home. But now what? He had no idea how to care for bear cubs. He wasn't even sure if they would survive the night. The cubs were still shivering, their tiny bodies curled up tightly against the cold. John knew he had to act fast. He rushed back to the house, his boots crunching through the snow, and returned with an armful of old blankets and a large, battered heating lamp he used for newborn calves. He draped the blankets over the cubs and positioned the lamp above them, hoping to provide enough warmth to stave off the freezing temperatures. As the heat began to seep into their fur, the cubs stirred slightly, their whimpers softening. John knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he gently stroked one of the cubs. Its fur was soft, but its body felt fragile, like it could break at any moment. He felt a lump rise in his throat. These cubs were so small, so helpless. They didn't deserve this. "Hang in there, little ones," John whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll do everything I can to help you." Over the next few hours, John worked tirelessly to keep the cubs alive. He warmed milk on the stove and fed them with a small bottle, one by one. At first, they were too weak to suckle, but eventually one of the cubs, a tiny female with a patch of white fur on her chest, latched onto the bottle and drank greedily. John felt a surge of hope. If one of them could eat, maybe the others could too. By nightfall, all 8 cubs had eaten at least a little, those who were still too weak to do much more than swallow a few drops. John stayed with them, sitting on the cold barn floor, his back against the wall. He didn't dare leave them alone. What if one of them stopped breathing? What if they needed him in the middle of the night? He couldn't take that risk. As the hours passed, exhaustion began to weigh heavily on him. His eyes grew heavy, and his head drooped forward. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard a soft sound, a faint, almost musical hum. He opened his eyes and looked around, confused. The sound was coming from the cubs. They were huddled together, their tiny bodies pressed close, and they were purring. It was a low, soothing sound like a lullaby. John had never heard anything like it. He felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if the cubs were thanking him, in their own way, for saving them. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away. He hadn't cried in decades, not since his wife had passed. But now, sitting here in a bar with these 8 little lives depending on him, he felt a flood of emotions he couldn't contain. The next morning, John woke to the sound of soft growls and playful yips. He blinked, disoriented, and realized he had fallen asleep on the barn floor. The cubs were awake, and they were playing. The tiny female with the white patch was batting at one of her siblings with her paw, while another cub was rolling around in hay, its tail wagging like a puppy's. John couldn't help but smile. They were still weak, but they were alive, and they were fighting. Over the next few days, John's life revolved entirely around the cubs. He named them, one by one, based on their unique markings and personalities. The tiny female with the white patch became Snow, while the largest and most adventurous cub was dubbed Rocky. There was Honey, with golden brown fur, and Shadow, who was darker than the others. The smallest cub, who was also the most timid, was named Peanut. The others, Bear, Maple, and Willow, each had their own quirks that made them special. John spent hours feeding them, cleaning them, and keeping them warm. He built a makeshift enclosure in the barn to give them more space to move around, and he even fashioned a small climbing structure out of old logs and planks. The cubs quickly took to it, clumsily climbing and tumbling over each other in their attempts to explore. Watching them play brought a sense of joy to John's life that he hadn't felt in years. But as the days turned into weeks, John began to realize just how much work it was to care for 8 growing bear cubs. They were eating more and more, and their playful antics were becoming increasingly destructive. They knocked over buckets, tore apart hay bales, and once even managed to open the barn door, sending John on a frantic chase through the snow to round them up. Despite the challenges, John couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. The cubs had become his family, his reason to wake up in the morning. They followed him around like a pack of loyal dogs, their tiny paws patting to the snow as they trailed behind him on his daily chores. They even seemed to understand when he spoke to them, tilting their heads and staring at him with their big, curious eyes. One evening, as John sat by the fire in his small cabin, he heard a soft knock at the door. He frowned. Visitors were rare, especially this time of year. He opened the door to find a young woman standing on his porch, her cheeks red from the cold. She introduced herself as Emma, a wildlife biologist who had heard about the cubs from a neighboring town. "I came to see if you needed any help," she said, her breath visible in the frosty air. Raising 8 bear cubs is no small task. John hesitated. He had grown so used to being alone that the idea of letting someone into his life, even just to help, felt strange. But he knew Emma was right. He couldn't do this alone forever. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside to let her in. Emma's eyes widened as she entered the barn and saw the cubs. They were much bigger now, their fur thick and shiny, their eyes bright with curiosity. Snow immediately trotted over to her, sniffing her boots before letting out a soft growl. "They're beautiful," Emma said, her voice filled with awe. "You've done an amazing job with them." John shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "I just did what I had to do." Emma spent the next few hours helping John clean the barn and prepare the cubs' meals. She showed him how to introduce solid foods into their diet and taught him how to recognize signs of illness. As they worked, John found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. He told her about his life on the ranch, about his wife, and about how the cubs had given him a new sense of purpose. Emma listened quietly, her eyes filled with compassion. "You've given them a second chance at life," she said. "But eventually, they'll need to return to the wild. Bears aren't meant to live in barns." John's heart sank at her words. He had known this day would come, but he hadn't wanted to think about it. The cubs were his family now. How could he let them go? As the weeks passed, John and Emma worked together to prepare the cubs for life in the wild. They built a larger enclosure outside, where the cubs could practice climbing and foraging. Emma taught John how to simulate natural behaviors, like digging for food and avoiding predators. The cubs thrived under their care, growing stronger and more independent every day. But as the time to release them drew closer, John felt a growing sense of dread. He had grown so attached to them, and the thought of saying goodbye was almost too much to bear. One night, as he sat by the fire with snow curled up at his feet, he found himself wondering if he was doing the right thing. "I don't know if I can let them go," he admitted to Emma the next morning. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression gentle but firm. "You've given them everything they need to survive. Now it's time to let them live the life they were meant to live." John nodded, but his heart ached. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The day of the release arrived, and John felt a mix of emotions as he led the cubs to the edge of the forest. They were no longer the tiny, helpless creatures he had found in the snow. They were strong, confident, and ready to face the world on their own. As he opened the gate to their enclosure, the cubs hesitated, their eyes fixed on him. Snow was the first to step forward, her gaze locking with his for a moment before she turned and disappeared into the trees. One by one, the others followed, until only Peanut remained. The little cub looked up at John, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Go on, little one," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "You'll be okay." Peanut hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and scampered after his siblings. John watched until they were out of sight, his heart heavy but also filled with a strange sense of pride. As he turned to walk back to the ranch, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Emma. "You did the right thing," she said softly. John nodded, but he couldn't speak. The cubs were gone, and for the first time in months, he was alone again. But as he looked out the forest, he realized that he wasn't really alone. The cubs were out there, living the life he had given them, and in a way, they would always be with him. The days that followed the release of the bear cubs were some of the loneliest John had ever known. The ranch felt emptier than ever, the silence heavier. Every morning, he would wake up and instinctively head to the barn, only to remember that the cubs were gone. The barn, once filled with their playful growls and the sound of tiny paws scampering across the floor, was now eerily quiet. Even the cattle seemed to sense the change, their low moos carrying a note of melancholy. John tried to throw himself into his work, hoping to distract himself from the ache in his chest. He repaired fences, chopped wood, and tended to his cattle with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The cubs had brought a sense of purpose to his life, a reason to keep going. Now, without them, he felt adrift. Emma visited a few times, bringing supplies and offering words of encouragement. She reminded him that he had done the right thing, that the cubs were where they belonged. But her words, though kind, did little to ease the pain in John's heart. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. One evening, as John sat by the fire, he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat. It was a soft, familiar growl coming from outside. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Could it be? He rushed to the door and threw it open, his eyes scanning the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the snow-covered landscape, bathed in the pale light of the moon. But then movement caught his eye. There at the edge of the forest stood Snow, the tiny female cub with the white patch on her chest. She was bigger now, her fur thick and glossy, but there was no mistaking her. She tilted her head, her eyes locking with his, and let out a soft, almost questioning growl. John's heart swelled with emotion. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow, but stopped himself. He knew he couldn't get too close. Snow was no longer the helpless cub he had rescued. She was a wild animal now, and he had to respect that. "Snow," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" The cub didn't answer, of course. She simply stood there, watching him for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the trees. John stood frozen, his mind racing. Had she come back to say goodbye? Or was she simply checking on him, making sure he was okay? The encounter left John with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was overjoyed to see Snow, to know that she was alive and well. On the other hand, it was a painful reminder of what he had lost. He spent the rest of the night staring into the fire, his thoughts consumed by memories of the cubs. Over the next few weeks, John began to notice signs that the cubs were still nearby. He would find tracks in the snow leading from the forest to the edge of the ranch. Sometimes, he would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, a flash of fur or the glint of an eye. He never saw more than one cub at a time, but he had a feeling they were all out there, watching over him in their own way. One day, while out checking the fences, John came across something that made his heart stop. There, lying in the snow, was a dead rabbit. It had been freshly killed, its body still warm. John knelt down, his hands trembling as he examined the scene. The rabbit had been cleanly dispatched, its neck broken with precision. This wasn't the work of a predator like a wolf or a coyote. This was the work of a bear. John felt a surge of pride. The cubs were learning to hunt, to survive on their own. They were thriving in the wild, just as he had hoped. But as he stood there, staring down at the rabbit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random kill. It was almost as if the cubs were leaving him a gift, a way of saying thank you. He carried the rabbit back to the ranch, his mind racing. That night, as he cooked the meat over the fire, he felt a strange sense of connection to the cubs. They were out there, living their lives, but they hadn't forgotten him, and he hadn't forgotten them. As the weeks turned into months, John began to adjust to his new reality. The ache in his heart never fully went away, but became more manageable. He found solace in the knowledge that the cubs were out there, living the life they were meant to live. And every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of them, a reminder that they were still watching over him. One day, while out chopping wood, John heard a sound that made him drop his axe. It was a deep, rumbling growl coming from the edge of the forest. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw a massive figure emerging from the trees. It was a full-grown bear, its fur thick and dark, its eyes sharp and intelligent. For a moment, John felt a surge of fear. But then, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The bear had a patch of white fur on its chest. "Snow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The bear tilted her head, her eyes locking with his. She let out a soft growl, almost like a greeting, before turning and disappearing back into the forest. John stood frozen, his mind racing. Snow had grown into a magnificent creature, strong and confident. She was no longer the tiny, helpless cub he had rescued. She was a queen of the forest, a force to be reckoned with. Tears welled up in John's eyes as he realized the significance of the moment. Snow had come back to show him that she was okay, that she had thrived in the wild. It was her way of saying thank you, of letting him know that he had done the right thing. That night, as John sat by the fire, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The cubs were out there, living the life they were meant to live. And though he missed them dearly, he knew that he had given them the best possible chance at survival. As he stared into the flames, he thought about the journey he had been on. He had started out as a lonely rancher, isolated from the world and consumed by his grief. But the cubs had changed everything. They had brought light into his life, a sense of purpose and connection that he had thought was lost forever. And now, as he sat there, he realized that he wasn't alone. The cubs were out there, watching over him, just as he had watched over them. They were a part of him, and he was a part of them. And no matter where life took them, they would always be connected. John smiled faintly as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The cubs had given him a gift far greater than he could have ever imagined. They had given him a reason to live, to love, and to hope. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he would carry that gift with him for the rest of his life. The seasons turned, and the snow began to melt, giving way to the first signs of spring. The mountains came alive with the sound of rushing streams and the chirping of birds returning from their winter migrations. For John, the changing of the seasons brought a mix of emotions. The arrival of spring meant new life, new beginnings, but also served as a reminder of the passage of time. It had been nearly a year since he had found the cubs, and though they were no longer a constant presence in his life, they were never far from his thoughts. One crisp morning, as John was out tending to his cattle, he noticed something unusual. The animals were restless, their ears twitching and their eyes darting toward the forest. John frowned, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed his rifle and cautiously made his way toward the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he heard a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. There, just beyond the edge of the forest, stood a massive grizzly bear. Its fur was a deep brown, and its muscles rippled beneath its thick coat. John froze, his grip tightening on his rifle. He had encountered bears before, but never one this large or this close to the ranch. The bear's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. But then, something unexpected happened. The bear let out a soft, almost familiar growl and took a step forward. John's breath caught in his throat as he noticed a patch of white fur on the bear's chest. It was Snow, She had grown into a powerful, majestic creature, but there was no mistaking her. "Snow," John whispered, his voice trembling. "It's you." The bear tilted her head, her eyes softening as she recognized him. She took another step forward, her massive frame moving with a grace that belied her size. John lowered his rifle, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always known that Snow and the other cubs were out there, but seeing her like this, so strong and confident, filled him with a sense of pride he couldn't put into words. Snow stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze never leaving his. She let out a soft growl, almost like a greeting, before turning and disappearing back into forest. John stood there for a long time, his mind racing. Snow had come back to see him, to let him know that she was okay. It was a moment he would never forget. Over the next few weeks, John began to notice more signs that the cubs were still nearby. He would find tracks near the ranch, and sometimes he would catch a glimpse of them in the distance. They were no longer the tiny, helpless creatures he had rescued. They were full-grown bears, strong and independent, but they hadn't forgotten him. One evening, as John was sitting on the porch, he heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. He turned, his heart skipping a beat, and saw a familiar face peeking out from the foliage. It was Peanut, the smallest and most timid of the cubs. He had grown into a handsome bear, his fur a rich, dark brown, but his eyes still held that same gentle, uncertain look that had earned him his name. "Peanut," John said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "Come on out, boy. It's okay." Peanut hesitated for a moment before stepping out into the open. He moved cautiously, his eyes darting around as if he were unsure of himself. John held out his hand, his heart aching with love for the little bear who had always been so shy. Peanut sniffed his hand, his nose cold and wet, before letting out a soft growl. John smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. "You've grown so much," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so proud of you." Peanut stayed for a while, sitting quietly beside John as they watched the sun set over the mountains. It was a peaceful, almost magical moment, one that John would treasure for the rest of his life. But as the sky darkened, Peanut stood up and turned toward the forest. He looked back at John one last time, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude, before disappearing into the trees. As the weeks passed, John began to notice something else. The cubs weren't just visiting him. They were also watching over the ranch. He would find signs of their presence everywhere. Claw marks on trees, overturned rocks where they had been searching for food, and even the occasional gift of freshly killed animal left near the barn. It was as if they were trying to repay him for everything he had done for them. One day, while out checking the fences, John came across something that made his heart stop. There, lying in the grass, was a small, helpless bear cub. It was alone, its fur matted and its body trembling from the cold. John knelt down, his hands shaking as he examined the cub. It was no more than a few weeks old, far too young to be on its own. "Where's your mama, little one?" John whispered, his voice filled with concern. He looked around, searching for any sign of the mother bear, but there was none. The cub was alone, just as Snow and the others had been when he found them. John's heart ached as he realized what he had to do. He couldn't leave the cub here to die. He would have to take it back to the ranch and care for it, just as he had done with the others. Gently, he picked up the cub and cradled it against his chest. It was so small, so fragile, and yet it stirred something deep within him. As he made his way back to the ranch, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was as if the circle of life had come full circle, bringing him back to where he had started. That night, as John sat by the fire with the new cub curled up in his lap, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The cubs had given him so much, a reason to live, a sense of purpose, and a connection to the world around him. And now, they had brought him another life to care for, another chance to make a difference. As he looked down at the tiny, sleeping cub, he realized that this was what life was all about. It wasn't about the things you had or the places you went. It was about the connections you made, the lives you touched, and the love you gave. The cubs had taught him that, and he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. John smiled faintly as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing. The fire crackled softly, and the cub let out a tiny, contented sigh. For the first time in a long time, John felt truly at peace. The circle of life had brought him here, to this moment, and he knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with an open heart. The years rolled by, and the ranch became a sanctuary, not just for John, but for the wild creatures that roamed the mountains. The little bear cub John had rescued grew into a strong, healthy bear, and just like Snow and the others, it eventually returned to the wild. But this time, John wasn't left alone. The cubs, now fully grown bears, continued to visit him, their presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared. John's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. He was no longer the lonely rancher he had once been. He had become a guardian, a protector, and a friend to the wild. His story had spread to the nearby town, and people began to visit the ranch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary bear man and his extraordinary connection to the animals. One day, a film crew arrived at the ranch. They had heard about John's story and wanted to document it for the world to see. At first, John was hesitant. He had always been a private man, content to live his life away from the spotlight. But Emma, who had become a close friend and confidant, convinced him to share his story. "People need to hear this, John," she said, her eyes filled with passion. "Your story is about more than just bears. It's about love, compassion, and the power of connection. It's a story that can inspire others to care for the world around them." John finally agreed, and over the next few weeks, the film crew captured the magic of the ranch. They filmed John tending to his cattle, walking through the forest, and even interacting with the bears. The footage was breathtaking. The majestic mountains, the lush forests, and the bears moving gracefully through their natural habitat. But the most powerful moments were the ones that showed the deep, unspoken bond between John and the animals. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the crew filmed John sitting on the porch with Snow by his side. The massive bear leaned against him, her head resting on his lap as he gently stroked her fur. It was a moment of pure, unguarded love, and it brought tears to the eyes of everyone who witnessed it. When the documentary was released, it took the world by storm. People were captivated by John's story, by the incredible bond he shared with the bears, and by the message of hope and connection that it conveyed. The film won awards, and John became a symbol of what it meant to live in harmony with nature. But for John, the fame and recognition meant little. What mattered to him were the bears, the ranch, and the life he had built. He continued to care for the land and the animals, his days filled with the simple, meaningful work he loved. And though the bears were wild, they never forgot him. They would visit from time to time, their presence a reminder of the love and trust they shared. One spring morning, as John was out walking through the forest, he came across something that stopped him in his tracks. There, lying in a bed of soft moss, was a newborn bear cub. It was tiny, its eyes still closed, and it was alone. John's heart ached as he realized that history was repeating itself. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he gently picked up the cub. "Looks like it's just you and me again, little one," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. As he carried the cub back to the ranch, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The circle of life had brought him here, to this moment, and he knew that he would do everything in his power to give this cub the same chance he had given the others. Years passed, and John grew older, his hair turning gray and his steps slowing. But his spirit remained strong, his love for the bears and the land as fierce as ever. The ranch became a place of pilgrimage, a symbol of hope and connection for people from all over the world. And though John's time with the bears was coming to an end, their legacy would live on. One evening, as John sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, he felt a presence beside him. He turned and saw Snow, her massive frame moving with the grace of a queen. She sat down beside him, her head resting on his lap, just as she had done so many times before. John smiled, his hand gently stroking her fur. "You've been a good friend, Snow," he said, his voice soft and filled with love. "Thank you for everything." Snow let out a soft growl, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. It was a moment of pure, unspoken connection, a testament to the bond they had shared for so many years. As the years went by, John's story became a legend, a tale of love, compassion, and the power of connection. The ranch continued to thrive, cared for by those who had been inspired by John's legacy. And though he was no longer there, His spirit lived on in the land, in the bears, and the hearts of everyone who had been touched by his story. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. John's story is a reminder that even in the coldest, most desolate places, there is warmth, love, and connection. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Let's spread the message of compassion and hope to the world. What do you think is the most powerful lesson from John's story? Is it the importance of compassion, the power of connection, or something else? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Until next time, take care and remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change a life.